Morning, everybody. Welcome. It's good to be with you today. I'm glad that we are here. If you are watching on YouTube, glad that you're with us. You are welcome to stay on YouTube. But if you want to participate in the discussion, and we would love for you to participate in the discussion, there's a link in the YouTube chat, which will take you to the St. Paul's website. And on that particular web page, there's a link to the Zoom webinar. We don't publish the direct link because of our worry about Zoom bombing, but we do bury that link on that page so that you can find it and you can participate in the discussion. If you're watching on the Zoom webinar already, great. Remember to use the Q&A feature as we share our questions and our comments. We still have a minute or so before we begin the series today, the session, so please join me in waiting a minute or two, and then we'll start. Let's start with a prayer, and then we can look at Mark together. Let us pray. Gracious God, you know us and you love us, and you feed our bodies with the food of the earth and our souls with the food of heaven. Help us feast upon your word again this day, that our study of your text, your word, your story will draw us deeper into you and deeper into communion with one another. In Christ's holy name I pray. Amen. So we're doing a series called Only Mark. Mark is our liturgical focus, the gospel focus for this current year, the lectionary year B that we are in. Most of our gospel lessons are from Mark. There are exceptions, and the last couple of Sundays in church have been exceptions. We spice in some John every now and then, and occasionally another synoptic gospel text for a feast day. But Mark is mostly our focus during this year, which we call Year B. It seemed like a good idea for us to talk about what's peculiar about Mark's telling of the gospel story, and that's been our focus. Last week, we looked at what I called the adoption. How curious it is that Matthew and Luke and John go out of their way to set up Jesus to enter ministry fully from the very start, whether it's a birth narrative, Luke's dramatic, multi-layered version, a Matthew's shorter but still clear version, or John's prologue that calls to mind the cosmic, universal Christ, the Word, who becomes flesh. All three of the other gospel accounts start by setting the stage so where by the time Jesus arrives, we all know exactly who he is and what he is about. Mark, on the other hand, doesn't give us any of that. Mark starts with John's baptism, and then Jesus shows up. And only when Jesus comes out of the water and the heavens are open and the voice speaks to him does the reader get a sense that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And even in that moment, we can't tell whether the Spirit and the voice are intended for Jesus alone or for those of us who are watching. And so Mark kind of launches in that way and allows us to begin to understand Jesus's identity only in the waters of Jesus's baptism. So we talked a little bit about that last week. But you can watch the previous classes videos. They kind of build upon each other, but most of them are intended to stand alone. So if you're with us and you haven't been a part of another series, don't worry, you won't have missed anything for today. Today I want to talk about the hurry. In particular, Mark's use of the word, what gets translated usually as immediately. But I want to acknowledge from the front end that this is the one class in this series that originally ended up on the cutting room floor, the first of the ideas that wasn't intended for the series. This is spring break here in Fayetteville, and our family thought we might be out of town this Sunday, so I didn't originally schedule this Sunday, but when it became clear that we were going to be here, I wanted to offer this class and tie in the first of them to be cut aside. So we're going to talk about the hurry or the immediately, the use of the word immediately, but I think we'll discover pretty quickly that time isn't necessarily the focus. So if you're watching on the Zoom webinar, share your questions and your comments whenever you have them using the Q&A feature, usually found at the bottom of your screen. Don't wait for me to ask for your questions or comments. You entering a question is kind of like raising your hand. It helps me know that you want to say something. I'm going to keep going until I hear from you. If you're watching on YouTube, again, you're welcome to stay where you are. But if you'd like to participate in the discussion, use the link found in the chat, the YouTube chat, and it'll direct you to the Zoom webinar and you can join us for the discussion. So let me set up a couple of background comments before we look at the text itself. The Greek words that we usually think of when we are focused on what is usually translated immediately, sometimes straight away. The Greek words are eutheos or euthus. Euthus is the root of eutheos, but eutheos is the one that occurs more often. Eutheos is a Greek word that means immediately, straight away, forthwith. Euthus is one that means right or straight or level. Euthus seems to be, we're not sure about this, but it seems to be from the Greek root eu, which means good, euthanasia, good death, Eucharist, good thanks. And then the other Greek word might be, and this is where we're not really sure, tithemi, to lay down. So kind of at the root of this word, which gets translated to us as immediately, is a good or a right laying down, a straight path, if you will. So when we say immediately, my English mind goes to time, chronologically immediately. But maybe a better concept, which doesn't get translated very well into English, is the concept of like a straight way, or straight away might work. But even when I hear straight away, I begin to think time. It's not just about time. It's also about kind of a straight path. So whenever we hear immediately, we might retranslate in our minds to in a straight path and fill it in. And of course, the words aren't going to work in that way, but that helps us begin to understand a little bit of the context. One scholar in particular notes that it's possible that Jesus and his companions, who likely spoke Aramaic, even though the gospel accounts are written in Greek, that the Aramaic doesn't quite fit what the Greek offers us. And that maybe, and again, this is conjecture, but maybe whenever we see the word immediately, it might be that the Aramaic term for that is closer to behold or look. And sometimes in Mark's gospel account, Mark will use a word in Greek that gets translated for us as immediately. And other times we'll use a different Greek word that gets translated for us, behold or look. But in Aramaic, those words are a lot closer, and there might even be an overlap, a complete overlap there, and it's just context where Mark is using one Greek word or the other. So it's possible that when Jesus and his companions are speaking, when they say what we eventually hear, Aramaic to Greek to English, as immediately, might just as much be look or behold. So the context is multifaceted. I'm not a linguist, you know that. I'm not an etymologist, you know that as well. Some of you are, and I hope you'll join me in this conversation later on. But I wanted you to begin to think about the words beyond what the English translation is. The only other thing that I mentioned is to note for you how fond Mark is of the words that get translated to us as immediately. Mark, 42 times, Mark uses this word in various forms. We're going to see about 15 of them today. In the whole of the rest of the New Testament, Matthew, Luke, and John, and all of Paul's writings and the rest of the letters and writings of the New Testament, in the rest of the New Testament, that same word or words only get used 12 times. So 42 in Mark, 12 for the rest of the New Testament, and only 6 in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. So these words, 12 in the New Testament, 6 in the Old Testament, except for Mark, where there are 42 examples. So Mark really likes this word. So something's going on either in Mark, maybe it's Mark's fond of that word, but what I want to get to, what I want to push us toward is to begin to understand why Mark is fond of that word. It might just be one of his favorite words, but I want to say maybe there's something about the way Mark is telling us the gospel story, the story of Jesus, that uses the word immediately or the concept of immediately, a straight path, a straight way, to begin to not just carry the story along, but actually to help us see something different, something fuller, something newer. So that's going to be the context for today. Questions, comments, again, use the Q&A feature. If you've got them, share them with me, and I'll certainly stop and look at them. All right, so let's look at some text. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully find the right text. All right, you might begin to think, gosh, we've read this text a bunch. And you're right, we have read this text a bunch. This is the beginning of Mark, from Mark 1. We're actually going to skip down just a little bit. But I want to read, it's a lot of text, but I want to read this for us and just listen, particularly for the words immediately, but unlike those faux interactive children's shows where the main character looks at the audience at home and says, "What is this?" and pauses for an answer. I don't want you to be like on a trigger, because if you're only listening for the word immediately, you'll miss the context of it, of course. So listen for the words immediately, but also as they come, notice what's coming before and after, and begin to ask, how is Mark using the word immediately to link different things together? What might Mark be telling us in this? So let me read from Mark chapter 1. We're going to have 4 different chapters of scripture. Most of them are fairly lengthy readings, so I'm going to do a lot of reading, but as I'm reading, if you've got a question or comment, flag it up for us on the Q&A. John appeared baptizing in the wilderness and proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair and wore a leather belt around his waist and ate locust and wild honey. And he preached, saying, "After me comes he who is mightier than I, the strap of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. Now, after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, proclaiming the gospel of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel." Passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in the boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. As they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him. They found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hands and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in the desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. Did you hear that? What do you notice? What do you notice? Robin suggests in the Q&A, Robin says it almost seems to mean next. I think you might be right about that. I think there's a real sense in which next, it's a link. And I wonder if almost like a storyteller, I mean, there's definitely an oral quality to Mark's gospel account. And I wonder if kind of like a storyteller, if Mark just kind of gets, that's his word, that's his transition word. Right? It's sort of moving from one thing to another. Maybe it does mean next, if you will. Yeah, what else do you notice? What else do you notice? Let me zoom out. I'm going to try to zoom out. The text, don't worry, the text will become too small for us to see. But I want you to notice with me how many times the word immediately shows up. Right? Look at all those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Isn't that interesting? You know, when we read a gospel story, when we read it in church or even in a Bible study, we cut these episodes out, right? We either read about the baptism, or we read about the wilderness, or we read about the calling of the disciples, or we read about the teaching in the synagogue, or we read about the healing at the household, or we read about the leper, right? We don't listen to all of these at once. It's a lot for us to listen to, but notice when we see the whole text, we get a lot of immediately. What do you notice about that? What's interesting to you about that? Notice, let's start with one. Let's just start with one. Let's start with the baptism. Let's start with what happened when Jesus came up out of the water. Verse 10. When Jesus came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. What if we think of the word immediately not only as being a chronological indicator, but something else? And I'll save what it might be for later. But if we took the word immediately and allowed it to at least mean something other than chronologically, think about how that sentence begins to hold together. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. How does it sound if we begin to think about that word? If we begin to think about that word not in a chronological sense, what might immediately mean to us? Right? What more might it mean to us? What might the chronological sense hint at but not fully get? Right? What is it about the coming up out of the water that is linked to the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove? I mean, if Mark only wants to tell us that no time passed by, he's missing the opportunity to make a connection, a deeper connection, right? Surely there's something else happening. Kristen notes that it certainly gives a sense of urgency, right? There's absolutely urgency here, absolutely urgency. Robin notes that it might mean behold or look, right? So imagine, let's reread that sentence. When he came up out of the water, look, he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Yeah, what that's different, right? That's different. if the narrator were to say, look or behold, the audience is drawn into the drama of the moment, the urgency of the moment, but also the maybe consequential connection. I don't want to suggest pure consequence. I've tried to hold back from that. I don't want us to suggest that the only reason that Jesus heard God's voice is because of the water. The water was magic. But I do think there's enough of a causal relationship for us to begin to postulate that there's something integral to baptism that led us to this. And temporal or chronological text helps us see that. If I were to say to you, no sooner did I pick up my umbrella than it started raining outside. The implication is not only that they happen next to each other, but there's a link. There's something about the picking up of the umbrella that I want you to imagine is making it rain outside. And that word immediately or as soon as allows us to see that connection without suggesting that the umbrella caused the rain. So if I said to you, it's raining because I picked up my umbrella, you would think that was ridiculous. But if I were to say, and again, this is all within the bounds of the English language, but don't necessarily work for Aramaic or Greek. But if I were to say, as soon as I picked up my umbrella, it started raining outside, I'm inviting you to wonder with me at the mystery of those connections without asking you to believe that I have power over the weather. And yet there's something else going on. There's a hand at work here. And the weather image, I think, works really well because that's kind of what Mark wants us to see, that the coming up out of the water and the heavens being torn open are absolutely linked, but not necessarily in a whenever Jesus comes out of the water, the lights go on, right? It's not in that way, but there's something fundamental about baptism, and there's something fundamental about the voice being said to Jesus that are linked, and Mark wants us to see it. And so Mark uses this word immediately, perhaps, to suggest it. Yeah, Evelyn notes that Jesus's ministry is confirmed and his actions are confirm this, right? Yet there's a way in which immediately is for us kind of a confirmation of the significance or the weight of this. Look at the rest of them. Let me find the immediatelys again, right? Doesn't that change how we hear verse 12? The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. Well, what Mark could be saying is he didn't get any time to pack a bag. He didn't have a time to start his ministry or say goodbye to his mama. As soon as he came up from the water, he went straight out into the wilderness without stop. And that might be part of it, but surely Mark wants us to hear something besides the fact that Jesus didn't have time to pack a bag. Mark wants us to see that there's something about the baptism and the voice and the Spirit and the wilderness, right? These are all hanging together, and chronology is one way for us to convey this bit, but not the only way. I asked somebody the other day who was looking at a spiritual autobiography to consider how we might orient that text, not chronologically, but thematically. And if we're going to tell the story of our lives, don't we start with our birth and go to where we are today, maybe even wonder what's ahead? But what does it mean for us to share a memoir in a spiritual sense that isn't just oriented around time? Maybe there's a going and a coming. Maybe there are overlaps that just don't fit chronologically. But I admit my Western English mind that always reads from left to right. That's harder for me to hold on to. But what else could Mark be telling us about the significance? What connections could Mark be making for us using these words immediately? Right? When Jesus asks them to follow him, immediately they left their nets and followed him. Part of that implies without hesitation. That's important. And preachers will often talk about how, without hesitation, they got up and followed him. But maybe Mark is suggesting to us that and something else, which is that there's something about Jesus' invitation to become fishers of men, fish for people, that help them follow their nets. And if we see fishing on both sides, then immediately becomes kind of a pivot point where the connection is made. Similarly, but in a slightly different way, notice in verse 20, immediately Jesus called Zebedee and his John, and they follow him. I wonder if this time, instead of saying the call is immediately followed by the answer, this time it's Jesus who seems to be doing something immediately. Jesus sees them and immediately calls them. What an interesting chiasmus, what an interesting structure. If we look at those two, right, we get Jesus calling, immediately follow, Jesus seeing, immediately calling, right? I wonder if, we get Jesus immediately disciples, disciples immediately Jesus, excuse me, Jesus immediately disciples, and this time disciples immediately Jesus. What an interesting sort of a chiastic structure, right? A poetic structure, if you will. Perhaps I'm asking more of Mark, perhaps than Mark had in mind, but that word immediately, it's not just about time, and that's what I really want us to hold on to, right? I've got a question. Evelyn invites us to think about the periods of discernment, so that what is it? What might it mean if immediately is not just a temporal way, but what if we change the word immediately to a straight path? Jesus said to them, I'm back in verse 17, right back here. Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And in a straightaway manner, they left their nets and followed him. Right? What full discernment there might be for them to recognize the clear path or the straight path without needing it to be a chronological bit. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So notice then, and these, sometimes it's easy to pick up. Sometimes it's harder. Notice what happens in the synagogue at Capernaum. I'm here in verse 21, right? They, that is Jesus and the disciples, went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. There's something about being in Capernaum and Sabbath and teaching, right? Notice as we continue, they were astonished at Jesus' teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. There's a bold statement about the nature of Jesus' teaching. Verse 23, and immediately there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. What is Mark trying to tell us about the nature of Jesus's being in the synagogue? That's where he belongs. His teaching, peculiar authority, and the presence of a man with an unclean spirit. Immediately there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. Mark doesn't tell us immediately a man walked into the synagogue. He tells us immediately there was a man. There are plenty of words available to Mark to describe the motion of that man into the synagogue. He could have said, and immediately they saw a man in the synagogue, or immediately a man entered the synagogue. But Mark leaves it in this way that almost doesn't make sense in English. Immediately there was a man in the synagogue. Well, how did he get there? Did he materialize? Did he beam in from a spaceship? No. Mark's not interested in the time sense. He's interested in the causal thematic connection between Jesus's teaching with new authority and one who shows up with an unclean spirit. There's a connection. Of course, the one who's teaching with authority is going to be confronted by those with unclean spirits. That's an area or a territory that's ripe for that kind of conflict. All of a sudden, this text, this immediately, this hurry, Mark seems to be a lot less interested in moving things along than he is in making thematic, theological, significant connections between one thing and another. Sometimes it is to move things along. Sometimes it is about time. Sometimes he's just propelling a story, but I'll suggest that almost every time there's more going on here, that he has something in mind. Now, notice, I'm going to back up a little bit, and we're going to spend a little bit extra time in chapter 1 because there's so many immediatelys. But I'm going to back up a little bit to verse 21, and notice this technique. And and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. One or more theologians have noticed that one of Mark's techniques is when he starts a new episode, when he starts a new mini chapter, that he will set the scene and then propel us into action in that scene using the word immediately. So they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, right? Almost like a blocking notes for a play, right? Interstage left, lights come on, and then the action happens, right? It's almost perhaps a narrative device that he likes to set the stage and then propel the action using the word immediately. Or sometimes, as we see in verse 29, he likes to use the word immediately to change to a new scene. Immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. straight away, the next chapter. We're turning the page and moving to the next chapter. Though I'll suggest that there's still a link between one chapter and the other. This time, when we start a whole new episode with the word immediately, I think Mark wants us to hear that episode A and episode B are linked with a thematic, not just a chronological, but a thematic connection. Notice, as we see at the end of the previous episode, verse 28, at once Jesus' fame spread everywhere throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. So his fame is spread immediately, and I can't remember if that's an example of immediately. I didn't look at the Greek for that, but it could be that that's a euthus. I'll look it up while we're talking. But notice that he at once his fame spreads everywhere throughout the surrounding region, and immediately he left the synagogue. Now, Mark doesn't want us to just know that he didn't waste any time shaking hands as he left the synagogue. Mark wants us to know, I think, that there's a connection between his fame spreading and him leaving and going to the house of Simon and Andrew, a quiet place where he's not in the spotlight. I think Mark wants us to understand that Jesus is, he's a little reluctant to accept that fame. Let me look. Yeah, indeed, in verse 28, and at once his fame, it's euthus, it's another euthus. So the translators here have given us at once, but you might as well have it immediately there as well. Yeah. All right, so let me pause for a moment. Questions, comments before we leave this chapter and move on to the next? As you're coming up with your questions, your comments, notice here the last example in verse 42. This one feels to me a little different, right? Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hands and touched him and said to him, I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. I wonder if that actually primarily is a chronological statement, which is that Jesus has the power to heal of leprosy completely. This isn't a go rub this cream on it once a week or once a day for 6 weeks and see if it goes away. This is Jesus has the power to heal immediately. So I think there is a clearer chronological statement here, and Mark's story benefits from the temporal sense of immediately. However, I also wonder if there's something about Jesus touching and the leprosy leaving, that there's a consequential nature of the word immediately as well, euthus as well. Anyway, questions, comments about this section of the text? Are you beginning to hear immediately in a way that isn't just temporal? I didn't check more than 3 or 4 translations in English of these sections of the Bible. Euthus, I mean, there's eutheos or euthus, there aren't that many ways to translate it. The King James Version likes to say straight away, which implies, the word straight, that's helpful. Almost all English translations will give us immediately. But I imagine that there are some poetic ways that you might be able to convey the nature of that without using the word immediately. All right, well, let's move ahead. Again, if you've got questions or comments, I hope you'll share them. I'm going to move to Mark 5. We're not going to read all of Mark 5 because we read most of Mark 5 last week or hinted at it last week and read it the week before. We've talked about Mark 5 with sandwiches, and we've talked about Mark 5 with secrets. Now we're going to talk about Mark 5 with immediacy and the use of the word immediately. Let me just go ahead and highlight for us. I can get the text. Oops. So now we can see the immediatelys. So there's only one at the beginning, and then the next episode has 3, and I want to note all of them, or 4 in the next episode, excuse me. So Mark 5 begins with the disciples getting in their boat and going across the Sea of Galilee, to the country of the Gerasenes, a primarily Gentile area. When Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. Hold on to that, right? Jesus steps out of the boat and is immediately met by this man. There's maybe Mark wants us to understand that he didn't do anything before he didn't have a chance to show up and do anything immediately met. But of course, that temporal chronological immediacy is more significant than that. Mark wants us to know that there's something about the nature of Jesus, who Jesus is, the Holy One, the Son of God, that when he gets out of the boat in an area where there's a demon, the demon's going to find him, right? That's part of what Mark wants us to know. So when we read that immediately, Mark's not only interested in carrying out the story and propelling it along, he also wants us to make that theological connection. But what I really want to focus on is the second part of Mark 5, where you'll see 4 examples. And again, we've heard this recently, but I'm going to read it again. And just listen for the immediatelys and ask yourself, what are they really connecting? What's really the point of these immediatelys? And a great crowd followed Jesus and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people wailing, weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. This chapter is a little harder. I'm curious, how do you make sense of those immediatelys? What's the link? What's Mark? Why is Mark using immediately? What is Mark trying to tell us? How might you translate some of those immediatelys? I'd love to hear from you. Emphasis on faith, Evelyn notes. There's a link of faith. Interesting. The woman's faith for sure, right? Her faith, she said to herself, and Mark even lets us hear her thoughts. For she said, if I touch his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, right? So there's a sense of she heard reports, she touched his garment because she knew that if she touched it, she'd be made well. And all of those pieces immediately, it's like throwing them into a blender. Immediately it worked, right? And likewise, Jesus, feeling the power dried out, immediately turned. Yeah, I wonder if there's a faith connection. In the second half, maybe the same way, right? Particularly the last immediately on the screen, that when they saw it, that is Peter, James, John, and the parents, they were immediately overcome with amazement. Yeah, there's something about faith there. What else do you notice? What else do you notice? I do feel like with the first example with the woman, Mark wants us to feel the ways in which the ingredients come together to produce a result, not just temporally, but impactfully, and in a form of necessity. She had heard the reports. She came up and touched him because she had said she knew in her heart that it would work. And those things come together to immediately produce the drying up of the blood flow, right? And she felt in her body that she was healed of the disease. So there's a lot of feeling, sensing, holding on to. Jesus likewise perceives in himself that power has gone out, and so we turn around. And so maybe we see a little chiastic structure there, a little sandwich, a little poem there, right? What she's feeling, what she does, what happens, what Jesus feels, and what he says, right? Says to her anyway, perhaps. The second part, isn't it interesting? I feel like they're held together almost in conversation with each other, right? Jesus says, get up, arise, and immediately she does that. So there's a connection, of course, between what Jesus says and what happens. But then does it unfold in the opposite way, right? She gets up and she begins walking, and those who saw it were immediately overcome with amazement. I wonder if again there's kind of a parallel or a mirror structure that Jesus is saying something and that produces the healing, and the healing they perceive it, and then they're overcome with amazement. The structure falls down because they don't say anything. He says something, but they don't say anything. So I wonder about that immediately. Um, I think in this case, because miracles are involved, maybe it wouldn't surprise us that the immediately is a temporal thing, right? Again, Jesus doesn't say get up, arise, and then have to say it a second time or a third time. There's a sense in which the healing hinges upon his words, but also there's a sense in which their faith comes immediately as well. That there's no gradual growth. That all they needed to believe was to see her get up. Maybe the implication is for us. What more do you need? What more do you need to immediately be overcome with amazement? Perhaps. Yeah. Right. Well, let's again share your questions or comments, but let's push ahead in particular because these are some stories that we aren't as familiar with. Let me see if I can make sure to. Oops, wrong one. All right. Uh, not as familiar with because we haven't read them recently. But again, Mark 6, the second half of Mark 6, two different episodes. We're not going to read the first one in great detail, but remember that when how John the Baptist died, Mark kind of interludes in the middle of Mark 6, has this sort of interlude to a previous episode when Herod got kind of tricked by his daughter-in-law and ended up having to kill John the Baptist. But notice verses 25 through 28, right, this section, she being Herodias's daughter, after hearing from her mother what she should ask for, immediately she came in and with haste said to the king and asked, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. I'm willing to bet that at once also here, excuse me, this at once is also a euthus. So let me start over with verse 25. And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head, right? So just remember the immediately. I don't think we're supposed to know that no time went by. I think we're supposed to know that the Herodias' daughter was motivated by her mother's request. It adds sort of layers of treachery to the story. And likewise, verse 26, the king was exceedingly sorry, but immediately sent, again, causality. He didn't want to break his word, so he gave in. It heightens the sense in which he does it because of his oaths, which again portrays Herod as an egoist of maximum measure. But what I really want us to focus on is the second part. And I'm actually going to start with verse 41 right here. And I'm going to read 41 to the end. And listen for the immediatelys. I wonder what you'll make of them. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when the evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored them that they might touch even the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. we don't usually read the story of the 5,000, the feeding of the 5,000, with the story of the boat, with the healings that follow. But surely Mark wants us to see the connection. And when we read verse 51 and 52, they did not understand about the loaves. We get that the walking on the water and the feeding of the 5,000 go together. You really can't separate them, though we do every time we read them. Why? What's the immediately here? What's going on? Robin, I really like Robin's observation. Robin suggests purposefully. There's a word that deliberately, right, purposefully, but it implies a sense of purpose there. Yeah, thank you for that invitation, right? Feeds the 5,000 and straight away, purposefully, immediately, laid it down just right, made the disciples get into the boat and go to the other side. What's the connection? Join me, and it's hard. This is hard stuff. Join me in just wonder with me, share your observations, your musings. Why does Mark connect for us the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water and the healings that come after? Why does he connect them? And how do the words immediately help us see the connection? What do you think? I don't have the answer, so I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, there's something about recognition, right? And maybe again we have Mark likes chiastic structures. Right? We have an ABA structure, right? We've got the crowds, we've got the disciples, and we've got the crowds. Right? The crowds eat and are satisfied. The disciples get in the boat. The crowds recognize him. But I think there's a question about what is that recognition? What are they really recognizing? Other gospel accounts, John, Jesus will say, you're only here because you ate your fill of the loaves. Search for the food that leads to eternal life. That's John's reinterpretation of what Mark is doing with the immediately, right? The people recognize him as the one who feeds them. Then he pushes the disciples out, and they have their own conflict in the water, and then they show up and the people recognize him again. And I wonder if what layers of recognition are going on here, right? Yeah, Robin notes that it connects the faith. The patterns connect them too. Yeah, thank you. What else? Evelyn wonders with me why he made them. Why does Jesus make them get into the boat? What does that mean? I mean, ordered them, I think might be a part of the root there. Why? What's that about? What are they learning about him on the sea? And notice they don't recognize him and they're terrified. And in response to the terror, he immediately speaks to them. There really wasn't anything immediate about it at all. He was going to walk past him. They saw him and were terrified. Then he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I." And immediately, the director of this might be scratching her head thinking, how am I going to portray immediately when there's no immediately? But of course, that word doesn't just mean a temporal immediately, right? It means something else, right? So yeah, just what's the connection between their confusion and their terror? Jesus is, it is I, ego ami, an I am statement, if you will. And their amazement, their astounding. And then the crowd recognizes him. Yeah, I mean, just join me in allowing the word immediately to not just be about time. And maybe that's enough for us. We've got one more passage that I want to look at, maybe my favorite, and we're not going to have time to read it in depth because we do have an 11 o'clock service and we've got to get to church. But notice, let me again show you what we see. I'm not going to read the whole text, but we read part of this last week about secret, right? This is after the transfiguration. Jesus and the disciples, the few disciples, Peter, James, and John, are coming down the mountain. Don't tell anybody what you've seen, right? So transfiguration, this is post-transfiguration, right? Then they get down the mountain, and this is where we get some immediatelys. When Jesus and those three disciples came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. So Mark has set the scene. Jesus and the three disciples show up, and the scribes are having an argument with the disciples. Verse 15, and immediately all the crowd, when they saw Jesus, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. What's that about? What is Jesus telling us about the nature of the argument of the scribes and the disciples? and Jesus' arrival and the clarity that's beginning to come clear. What's Jesus saying? What's Mark saying about Jesus? What's Mark saying about the disciples? What's Mark saying about the crowd? Skip down to verse 20. In the midst of this same paragraph, a father who was trying to get his son, an epileptic son, healed and couldn't get it healed by the disciples. Verse 20, the disciples brought the boy to him, or some brought the boy to him. And when the spirit inside the boy saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. Layers of who is this Jesus, right? We've got the disciples who are arguing with the scribes, religious authorities. There's an argument, again, conflict. The same conflict that Jesus has embodied is now spreading to the disciples. Immediately the crowd becomes torn up in this way, right? Yes. They see Jesus and something changes. Jesus' arrival changes things. Then when the boy is presented, when the spirit sees Jesus, there's an immediate effect. And in the same way, there's also an immediate response of the Father when faith is evoked of him. This is not, I don't think Mark wants us to know that the Father came to faith like the snap of a finger. Mark wants us to see that when Jesus assures him that all things are possible, that's enough for him to cry out with belief. Right? In the same way that when the evil spirit sees Jesus, that's enough to convulse the boy. No words needed to be said. No other framework needed to be offered. Let me check your questions. Kristen notes, perhaps this is showing that there are no limits of the miracles of Jesus and faith in God. Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. That Mark wants us to see that this is all coming out. And it's not just about coming out quickly. It's about coming out without limit. Yeah. Evelyn notes, the revelation of his authority is shown by the word immediately. Yes, he's one whose presence immediately produces a reaction, but it's not just about the time, right, Evelyn? It's about the nature of his presence. Absolutely. So as we close, I know every time we finish, it's always a rush, but let me finish by saying a couple of things. Notice how Mark uses immediately. Sometimes it's to link one episode with another, and we're starting a new chapter. We're starting a new mini chapter, if you will, and Mark wants us to kind of reframe what we're doing, but I think he always wants us to see a connection between the former and the latter, especially when that second sentence comes with an immediately and he's launching us into action. Sometimes it seems that Mark just wants to keep things moving immediately. But if we're only hearing this as a narrative device, I think we get to miss the theological significance. Sometimes it means immediately without hesitation. But sometimes that hesitation or lack thereof is not about temporal hesitation. It's about theological or epistological formation, that faith formation, right? That the belief comes without hesitation, not without this kind of hesitation, but I don't need any more proof. It's clear. Mark is using immediately to show consequence. Consequences, B follows A, and it's not just a temporal consequence, it's a purposeful or a theological consequence. And behind all of that, I think we see divine causality. Remember, especially in that first example, baptism, immediately the spirits are opened, immediately the Spirit drives them into the wilderness. That's not just happening quickly, it's happening because there's another hand that's holding it together. Kind of like I pick up my umbrella and it starts to rain. I don't mean to suggest that I have power with my umbrella, but that some way the universe is kind of winking at me. You might have heard. I think these are all winks. These are all moments that Mark wants us to see behind the text. And if we only hear immediately as being a language about hurry, then actually we'll miss the real theological meat of what Mark is offering us. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's good to be with you all. Next week, we're going to look at Mark's version of the Passion Story. It's Palm Sunday. Appropriate for us to look at that. And we're going to try to have a class on Easter Day. Normally, we wouldn't have an adult forum on Easter Day, but because of this format, I think we can do that. And we'll look at the resurrection, another peculiarity of Mark. Let's finish today by praying together the prayer that Jesus has taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.